Hello, and welcome to what will be a thought-provoking panel discussion today. My name is Nathan Maloney, and I work at Living Water International. I'm also the co-chair of the Accord Research Alliance. And I recently had the opportunity to contribute to a new book that's out. It's called International Development and Local Faith Actors. And it's a book that's edited by Kathryn Kraft, who is with us on the panel today, and Olivia Wilkinson, who gave a keynote speech during last year's Accord Research Intensive. And this book's part of the broader Routledge Research in Religion and Development series, which also has a lot of other helpful books that I've enjoyed reading as well. But today we wanted to bring together a few of the contributors to the book to have a brief discussion around their chapters in the book and to give us all a chance to reflect on how the theme of listening to community stakeholders, equity in listening, applies to that context. So first, let me start with Kathryn Kraft, who is a senior lecturer in international development at the University of East London, and also a senior research advisor for faith and development with World Vision. So, Kathryn, you were the co-editor for the book. So first, can you just help give a brief overview of the book overall?
The idea of the book kind of came to me when I started working as a research advisor for World Vision and was asked to put together a cohesive research agenda for understanding the contribution of faith to World Vision's development programs. And I realized there was a lot out there, but there wasn't really any solid kind of specific data or evidence that could make a statement about this is what faith contributes. And yet there had been years and years of research studies done, both commissioned by World Vision as well as by other organizations looking into the role of faith in development. And so I started to think, wouldn't it be really great to kind of see what is the common strand across these years of research and what is the common voice that's starting to come out of that. Meanwhile, Olivia was working with the Joint Learning Initiative for Faith in Local Communities on kind of shutting down what they called at the time the mobilization hub. And she realized a lot of partners had been doing really fantastic work in terms of reflecting on how they engaged local faith communities. So the idea of this book was to bring together the various little bits and pieces, some of which are quite impressive bits and pieces of evidence building on faith and development to try to develop a cohesive narrative. So what the volume does is bring both academic voices, theoretical perspective, practice-based perspectives, various different ways of looking at the role of faith in development into this discussion about where the encounters between faith actors and the humanitarian community lie.
That's great. And so you mentioned there the idea of encounters, and that is a theme of the book, the ideological and the cultural encounters. And a lot of the chapters talk about those encounters between international NGOs and local faith actors or local faith communities. And as we think about the power imbalances that we can often see when NGOs try to engage or mobilize local faith actors, what role do you think listening can play in helping to achieve more equitable relationships? And are there any specific examples you'd highlight from the book?
I think one of the things that I really appreciated about working on this is that every collaborator that we worked on, all 16 chapters, we worked with people who already have a sensitivity to that listening. As is unfortunately often the case in research, most of the chapters do come from the perspective of the international coming to the local, which is a perennial gap in research in this space. But nonetheless, they come with a genuine desire to listen to the local and to understand. And I think the organizations that they've partnered with, do that to varying degrees of success, but they all have the commitment to try to do that, to do the listening. And you told me ahead that you wanted me to call out specific chapters, and it's very hard because obviously we're proud of all of the chapters. But I think, and I do think all of the chapters do address this, but I did think that there were 3 chapters that came to mind, that not that they do it better, I think, than the other chapters, but maybe take a more unique perspective and thought-provoking perspective to how to do this. The first one was Carola and Kaneke of Queen Margaret University. Both of them together wrote a chapter on faith leader wives. And I thought that was a really, really interesting angle to take. There's this actor in the community, this group of women, for the most part, who are doing whatever they can. And sometimes it's very little, and other times it's a lot, but they have this passion to try to collaborate with the government actors, with the INGO actors, with the humanitarian actors. And it's just, it's this group of people that we often even seem to forget. The second one was Sabil's chapter on the Cameroonian healthcare system and its funding, its international funding networks, and how they interact with international donors. And I think, again, that perspective of this is a very specific need, and it's a very historic reality, and these relationships have been going on for a very long time. And both actors, both the funders and the Cameroonian healthcare providers, have quite a lot of agency and quite a lot of power. But how they interplay with one another is a constant dialogue. And then the final one that I was going to call out was Lisa, who's on the call with us today, and Laura, their chapter on Colombia, and a very interesting perspective, and really challenged my thinking on how local faith actors have a unique and potentially greater sensitivity to understanding sensitive social issues in the context of this chapter, sexual and gender-based violence, and their sensitivity to what's going on in the community, that the international community really could learn so much from them. So those are the 3 I chose to call out, but all the chapters were really great.
Thanks, Katie. And I agree. I actually just recently read the chapter that you mentioned from Lisa about the work in Colombia, and found it extremely helpful for myself and my work. So, and again, all the chapters are helpful, as you point out, but next, I want to go to Lincoln Lau and bring him in. So those of you who have been around the Accord Research Alliance will recognize Lincoln, as he's previously given a keynote speech a couple of years ago and has also been on our podcast. He is the Director of Research at International Care Ministries, which works in the Philippines, which is where I think he is today. Lincoln, in your chapter, you talked about how collecting and sharing data can help in your relationship with local pastors that you work with. So can you explain a little bit more about the process for that, and how exactly do you reflect on the data with the local pastors?
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. I think that's a really interesting question, and it's one that we continue to wrestle with. But if there was one thing that I really like to highlight as we reflected on this question, and it was wonderful to be part of this book and have the opportunity to think clearly about this, was how, as we approach development in our context here, we really wanted to do this in partnership with pastors. And I think sometimes what happens in development and community development is that the data gets lifted and it doesn't become part of the community partners anymore. So the data kind of gets removed from that layer and belongs, quote unquote, which it shouldn't, to the practitioners or the decision makers or the funders, and often foreign organizations and things like that. But what we were trying to do, and what we're still definitely not perfect at, but trying to move towards, is to create systems so that the pastors can work with their own data. And I think that's been really important, is to create systems that and the infrastructure that's in place, so that if we partner with a certain community that a pastor is engaged with, that he or she can see the data of his or her own community, and understand how the data reflects and provides a different maybe understanding of their context than just the maybe walking around the village, which is also very important. But it's a different angle, and I think another tool that can be used to know how to approach the village and the communities that they're working with. So I think that really was a system that allows us to work together on data instead of extract data.
That's great. And I think, obviously, if the pastors are able to see the data themselves and you can reflect on it together, that's, a really important aspect of, ensuring some of the equity in the partnership that you would have. I kind of also want to explore a little bit, thinking maybe on the other end of that a bit is, because you do have a broad network, so I think you're working in over 1,000 communities. There could over 8,000 local pastors. And, you mentioned working to develop this system, to look at the data and reflect on the data together. But more from an organizational perspective, I guess, I was curious, how do you, because you're collecting a lot of data, how do you listen at scale to ensure that you are hearing the input of the local pastors and having equitable relationships so that what the local pastor is saying can influence the work that's happening?
Sure. Yeah. So for us here in the Philippines right now, we're not huge. We're not a massive organization, but we have about 400 and 450 full-time staff that are working with international care ministries here in the Philippines. And I think part of making sure we listen, it can't just be a couple of us that are thinking about listening, especially when it comes in terms of data. So a big part of it is training and discussing data in a way where we are consciously listening to all the different angles and the different thoughts that everybody has. And so what we've been trying to do is, as you can imagine, to work with a network of, over 5,000, over 8,000 right now, and we're approaching 10,000 pastors. It means that there is somebody within our organization that interacts with them, maybe weekly or monthly. And it's to make sure that these individuals in our organization are also practitioners of listening. And it can't just be one or two of us in the organization. We all need to be listening to one another. And so I think that, again, it's a mixture of system, but it's also of culture within the organization to pay attention to what the data is telling us, to try to be, when we're having meetings within our organization, to listen to all the voices and to think through what is the data telling us. And it's interesting that we're doing this podcast this session during this time because of COVID. And we've really had to listen to the data with a lot of the work that we're doing. We're listening to the food security issues. We're listening to the urgent issues. And that's what we're trying to do, is to make sure that everybody that's engaged in the communities that we work with also has a culture to really listen and to care and to think through whatever data we're collecting. How can we best serve the communities that we get engaged with?
Great, thank you, Lincoln. And I think, I love the idea of that, of everyone in the organization being able to listen and understand the value of listening. And I know that's a lot of what this week is about, is understanding the principle and the practices around listening. So thanks for pointing that out. I now want to bring in Sandra Pertek, who is a researcher at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And she has also previously served as a senior policy advisor on gender at Islamic Relief Worldwide. So Sandra, your chapter was on the intersectionality of child protection and gender-based violence within Islamic Relief, and the role that local faith leaders can play. Now, these are obviously sensitive topics. So what would you say it takes for a faith-based organization like Islamic Relief to foster cultural change from within faith communities?
Thanks, Nathan. Oh, well, this is a very good question. So I think it all begins from asking and listening to different stakeholders, exactly as your conference highlights, listening with equity. So giving attention and going agenda-free sometimes when we go to the communities, creating spaces to talk about the issues that matter to people. I think that's the first step, showing respect and care by listening to the community perspectives so we can understand the problem and identify the entry points. I think just by listening attentively as we conduct, for example, gender needs assessments or any situational assessments, it's crucial so we can understand the exact sensitivities and barriers that women and men, boys and girls face in their communities. So the cultural change from within faith communities is, I think, all about discovering the resources and perspectives that faith communities nurture, that they hold, so we can help them through their own resources, challenge GBV and child abuse, as the chapter is discussing, an integrated approach, from within their own perspectives, from within their own beliefs and cultures and traditions. So I think the organizations such as Islamic Relief and Islamic Relief itself as a catalyst in facilitating discussions that can help communities learn and reflect. I think the organizations need to be ready to listen to communities and devise strategies together so they can achieve things that matter to them the most, and not necessarily to what matters to the organizations, but what matters to people on the ground. We can use obviously different methodologies, different outreach initiatives, and encourage discussion, reflection, and behavior change. For example, to dismantle religious practices from cultural ones. Yet sometimes organizations need to offer first practical support to meet basic needs so the communities are in the position to engage in reflection and dialogue for cultural change. So just to summarize, by educating communities through listening and dialogue and hopefully using credible religious resources, we often need to go back to the basics and open up our minds and hearts to listen.
Great. So maybe to go just a little bit deeper on that, I think what you're saying there makes a lot of sense. As you're thinking about as a, for faith-based NGO, even if it's of the same faith, working with local faith actors of the same faith, and what would be some signs or what would be some ways to make sure that you are actually listening well and perhaps not just telling others what think should be the case in certain areas? How do you make sure you're listening well?
I think it all starts from clarifying our intentions and removing our bias, clarifying why are we engaging with communities, and to that end we need to open our minds and hearts to understand the other. We need to celebrate the diversity and open up and talk to all different people different to us. Often the solution to harmful practices is actually in the problem itself. So by listening before telling, we can identify the problem. We can learn something new, which before maybe wasn't so apparent, so we can find a solution to what we are learning. And through listening, we can establish trust, of course, which is mutual. So if we listen to people will want to listen to us. And in this process, will be fundamental to actually go to these voices that are less heard in our communities, the indigenous voices of women and girls in some communities, to build upon positive elements of their cultures and religions, so we can build bridges and alliances. One quick example, if I may just recall, is from the Somalia regional estate in Ethiopia, and discussed shortly in that chapter. So we knew that there were gender inequality and gender-based violence undermining development efforts in these communities. We did the assessment first, we listened first, we were not telling anything in this assessment process, even if we really wanted. Then we analyzed the community responses, including their recommendations, and together with the local staff who were part of these communities, we came up with a solution. As part of the intervention, we ran community conversations, exactly to ask questions and listen to communities, creating opportunities for discussion and facilitation together. So the local champions and faith leaders, by coming together with communities, could foster dialogue and develop GBV responses, gender-based violence responses, using people's faith and cultural resources. So for example, to oppose FGMC, we first created these community conversations wherein we explained the harmful health consequences, and with help of the local leader, we delinked this practice, FGMC, from a faith perspective. Once the practitioners realized that themselves that this practice is sinful, they promised not to withhold this practice, and obviously it's a long-term transformation process which requires alternative livelihoods, opportunities to sustain their commitment to withhold FGMC. And yeah, from listening, we attentively, with open heart, we debunk the misconceptions collectively.
Great, thank you so much for your reflection there. Very helpful. And finally, I'm excited to hear from Elizabeth Roux. She is the research director of the Unit for Religion and Development Research at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. So welcome, Lisa. Now, you've conducted lots of research over the years for different organizations, and in fact contributed to 3 different chapters for the book. So my first question for you would just be on your research methodology overall. So when you are conducting this type of research on religion and development, how do you make sure you are listening well within that research and ensuring that it is equitable?
Thanks, Nathan. This is a big question. Like, I could talk about this for hours, and I think we should be talking about it for hours, but I'll keep it short. I think the key thing is in how we approach research and what we see as the goal of research. So Lincoln was talking about this, about research not being extractive. And in my own research and in some of the chapters that I contributed to the book, there was a very intentional approach in methodology and in the tools that we're using to be participatory in the research. So in the actual ways that you engage, that it's not just who you're listening to, but so it is who you're listening to, who you're giving the opportunity to give voice, but who's also allowed to listen and who's allowed to interpret the data. So this also connects with what Lincoln was talking about. So increasingly, since the research that I reported on the book was conducted, but especially in the last 3 years, myself and my team, we've been really working to be more creative in the methodologies that we use in research, that we can really not just make it a participatory process in name only, but that the entire process, the decision making, who gets to talk, who gets to listen, and who gets to interpret, that is a joint space held by researchers with practitioners, with community members, because there's value in all 3 of those spaces, very important contributions. So I think that's the first key thing, is that we need to start thinking more creatively around the research methodologies that we use. And this doesn't just go for research, I think it goes for meal processes in general. I think we need to start thinking a bit more out of the box. And this connects to the second point. I think we need to think a bit more about what we recognize as evidence and as knowledge. I've been doing more and more work around practice-based knowledge and how this can and should be central in meal processes and in adaptive programming. And practice-based knowledge takes seriously the learning from those in the field, the learning from the doing, not just external evaluators coming in. And I realize I'm often such an external evaluator, but this raises such important questions about not just who you're listening to, who's listening, who's interpreting, but also when do we listen? Is it only at the end of an intervention? Is it only at the end of a project? Why are we not listening throughout? So I think genuine listening is not just about, there's more to it than just who we listen to. And we tend to kind of get stuck on who we're listening to. There's a lot to it.
Well, that's great. And I think just quickly, what really stood out to me is thinking about who is listening, who has the opportunity to listen, and when are we listening? I think are 2 really, really great points, and encouraging us to be more creative in how we think about that. And then just briefly, one of your chapters and some of the research you've done has been centered around World Vision's Channels of Hope program, which addresses controversial social issues such as gender constructs and violence. What role does or should listening play in these types of programs that you've researched, especially when there is theological content being shared with faith leaders on these issues?
I guess I should note before replying that, in replying, it's not just based on my experiences in doing research on Channels of Hope, but also from other faith-based programming in other parts of the world. I think a first key thing to realize is that on these hard issues, like if you're working on sexual violence or violence against women or FGMC, like Sandra was talking about, it's not just about increasing knowledge. It's not just about giving information. That will not lead to the long-term change in beliefs and behaviors that we need in order to change these practices. We know that if you're working on such controversial issues like violence against women, you have to engage with the underlying social norms. And in order to do that, you have to create genuine spaces of experiential learning, where people get the opportunity to talk and to listen and to reflect. So it's not just this transfer of information. And this is even more the case, I think, with theological content. So it doesn't work if you just feed people a reinterpretation of a piece of scripture, or give them a counter narrative to the dominant interpretation of a sacred text. There has to be genuine engagement and conversation about faith and the selection and interpretation of a sacred text, and how this is enmeshed with culture and can feed into harmful social norms and practices. And this is a lengthy process, and it's a process of conversation, and it's not a once-off training. And that is where I think most violence prevention programming around these controversial issues is where it goes wrong, be it faith-based or secular ones. Changing fundamental social norms, it requires hard conversation and it needs time. So it's listening and talking and exchange. And like Sandra was saying, it's about relationships of trust. And so many programs go in with this approach of, okay, this is the right thing to think and do, and now I'm going to convince you about it. Or even worse, like I'm just going to give you the information and then that'll change your behavior. But we have to commit to the hard conversations and the messiness, and also going into these spaces not knowing what the outcome will be. You can't go in with this mindset of, I'm just going to be changing what you're thinking. But you continue to commit yourself to that conversation and that relationship. So I guess now reflecting on it, I think genuine listening is about your own attitude and how you maybe let go of power in that process of listening and talking.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you. This has been an extremely rich conversation. I wish we could go deeper and further in all of these areas. But maybe just to wrap up, I do want to give all four of you an opportunity just to just give a quick reflection, maybe something you're taking away from the conversation today, or something that really stood out to you. And maybe just 30 seconds, if possible. And I'll go in reverse order here. So Lisa, if you want to get us started.
Yes, and throughout what I've been saying, I've been connecting to what Lincoln and Sandra has been talking about, Lincoln in their programming, this idea of what really echoed with me about we're working together instead of extracting data. That's a fundamentally different approach to research. And Sandra, and I know that project in Ethiopia that she talked about, that was really challenging to create a space like this, to be genuine open to whatever this community might be dictating. And they went into that scary space. And I think, to great effect. It takes courage, and that makes me excited as well.
Great. So then we can go, Sandra, then Lincoln, then Katie.
Well, there have been so many great points mentioned. They resonate with my thinking process throughout the years. Just a few. So we need to brace for a marathon. It is not just a sprint run. We are really conquering a marathon, a lifelong. Obviously, this cultural change takes it's a lengthy process. It takes lots of time, and we need to allow for this to be not quite obviously we want to see change, but we don't want to create further harm. So we need to be just patient and systematically through creative approaches, as Lisa was encouraging us to invent new creative approaches to proceed with our goals. And the issue that Lincoln mentioned about balancing power, I think it's so important that we need to be able to let our power go sometimes. And this requires courage, as it was already mentioned by Lisa, I believe. So yeah, I'm excited to continue and meet you again.
Yeah, so very quickly, really grateful to be on this panel. And I think I love what Lisa was saying about creativity. I think the issues that we're trying to tackle are so complex, so complicated. There's so many dimensions to what's happening. And but at the same time, you know, we are filled with hope that we can do something about these issues. But I really feel like the way that we try to address this might be a mixture of old and new methods, might be a mixture of, you know, things that we never even thought about, borrowing from other fields and other thinkers as we try to do this together. So I love the ideas of partnerships across different realms, different positions, different people, all sorts of people working together at this, and creativity being at the core as we collaborate to try to tackle some of these issues that have been entrenched in societies for a long time. But I think being on this panel, it just gives me excitement and hope as there's just so many courageous people working in this field. So yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I'm really encouraged. This is great to interact with all of you who we've exchanged a million emails with, and well, I've met you all in different contexts, but it's really, I think, a reminder to me that we're in a great moment in terms of history of understanding faith and development, that I think we now know there's something really great there. Our faith partners are doing amazing work and they have something important to contribute. And so I think two things that this leads me to. The first is we need to be bold. We need to be bold and exercise that creativity and really understand the tough questions and understand them. Ask the difficult questions in the difficult ways to ask them so that we get the answers that we feel confident in moving forward with those answers. But then also at the same time, continue to hear stories like we've been hearing in this session. I think it's just really important for us to continue to expand our knowledge and our understanding by listening to the experiences of others. So thanks all for sharing.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks again to all of the panelists for taking time out to come talk. And thanks to those for listening to us today. We do have some discussion questions for you to continue to reflect on based on today's conversation, which I hope you'll do. And if you're so inclined, I do encourage you to check out the book on Routledge's website, where you can dive into the full chapters for all of our panelists here today and from many others as well. So thanks again, and hope you have a great day.